And the acting head of the Australian National University Strategic and Defence Studies Centre, Professor John Blaxland, joins us now from Parliament House. John Blaxland, good morning. So this meeting is going to be taking place on an aircraft carrier. There's a US aircraft carrier and submarine in the vicinity of Korea. Tensions are extremely high over North Korea. The optics of this are all very militarily oriented. If Korea was to break out into some sort of actual conflict, what would the likely call on Australia involve?
Well, that's a good question. It's interesting, as we think about what could happen, it's worth reflecting on what has happened in the past. And what we did during the Korean War was we sent, firstly, fighter jets and Royal Australian Navy ships to contribute to a coalition effort. And then we sent infantry and we sent the larger part of a Army brigade group to Korea to contribute to the US-led UN-mandated mission there. Now, the scenario we're facing today is quite different to what it was back then. But conceivably, we have a defence force that's not that much larger than it was back in the early 1950s. We have essentially 3 regular brigades, a special forces group, a fairly boutique-sized Navy and Air Force, but with some very high-tech capabilities. And we have essentially put ourselves in a position where we have the option to contribute forces that can pretty well plug and play with a US-led contribution. So that could be a range of capabilities, including our naval ships that contribute to exercises in the Sea of Japan, have done so in previous years. It could be air warfare. We don't have the air warfare destroyers fully available at this stage, but we have ships that can contribute to the overall picture that the US Navy would be building there in the Sea of Japan. In addition to that, we have our Growler electronic attack aircraft, which are very much plugged in with the US system, very much interoperable with the American system. And then in addition to that, in terms of ground forces, while it's highly unlikely we would ever be called on to contribute combat forces, we do have the capability to contribute specialised capabilities from our incident response regiment to deal with chemical weapons of mass destruction effects in South Korea, say. But beyond that, it's important to put this in the context of what might actually happen, and that's a conversation we can have as well.
Do you believe it's fair enough to assume, though, that those are the kinds of specifics that might be the source of discussion at this meeting between Donald Trump and Malcolm Turnbull?
Well, look, it's a good question. My sense is that what we're doing in the Middle East is actually, on one level you'd think, well, why is Australia spending all this effort on the Middle East when there are so many issues in East and Southeast Asia that we should be focusing more strongly on? And on one level, it makes sense to keep playing in the Middle Eastern space because we're already invested there. And it's not as politically controversial in Australia for us to continue maintaining the steady state contribution in Afghanistan and in Iraq. And the way we've configured it so far, it's sustainable. We've got rotations of forces that can contribute to do that. Scenarios that might emerge in closer to home in Southeast Asia or Northeast Asia, they're more problematic. We're facing a challenge that could potentially see a large number of Australians put in harm's way, in a way, to a greater extent than we've seen in the Middle East. Now, in the Middle East, as I say, we've been very, very careful. We're not fighting against a major power that has air power, for instance, that can threaten mass destruction on Australian forces and coalition forces. In the North Korean scenario, however, in any other conflict that might emerge in Asia, it's not quite the same. We face much more of an existential challenge in Asia, and particularly on the Korean Peninsula at the moment.
So if, in fact, Donald Trump was to use this meeting to push for some sort of Australian contribution to what's happening in Korea, do you believe that Malcolm Turnbull should argue what you've just set out there?
Well, partly yes. And the other part to the equation is that the setup between the Republic of Korea Army, the Army of South Korea, and the US forces stationed there is already pretty robust. So while Australia might be asked to wave a flag to help out, in essence, the United States, along with a very robust capability embedded in Korea already with the Korean Armed Forces, doesn't really need Australia.
Right.
And for them to need Australia, we'd be facing a set of dire circumstances. And that's not completely implausible, but it's certainly at the less probable end of the spectrum.
If this does not break out into actual conflict and the US simply wants to increase the pressure on North Korea, do you think it's likely Donald Trump will use this meeting to ask for that? And what could Australia contribute in that scenario in terms of more troops being rotated through the Darwin or something like that?
Yeah, no, certainly the arrangements in Darwin have proved quite thorny over the last few years. They have to do with agreements over funding and resourcing, maintenance, quarantine, storage of equipment and rotation arrangements. So it's not that straightforward. It is actually reasonably complicated. So that arrangement in itself is probably going to go ahead incrementally. What we've already seen from Australia, and this is something the Prime Minister and Julie Bishop, the Foreign Minister, have been making very clear, is stronger rhetoric. Engaging with China, encouraging China to play a more constructive role, because really when you think about what's happening on the Korean Peninsula, who has the most influence? Now, some pundits are saying, oh, China doesn't have that much leverage. Look, that's true on one level. It doesn't have nearly as much leverage as it used to, but no country has more leverage than China. And the pressure that China has been applying on South Korea, for instance, over the Terminal High Altitude Air Defence, or the THAAD missile defence system that's being installed at the moment in South Korea, why isn't that pressure being applied to North Korea instead, for them to back down? After all, the whole reason for the deployment of the THAAD is because of North Korea's nuclear weapons proliferation challenge. And without that, or were that to be circumscribed or contained along the lines of what we've seen in Iran and the international agreement that was pulled together to convince Iran to come to an agreement with the rest of the world, essentially. That's the kind of pressure I think we could see apply. That's something that Australia could contribute more on, and it's certainly something that the Japanese and the United States and the South Koreans would probably be very happy to see.
And speaking of leverage, does the US have significantly more leverage over Australia now, having agreed to honour the refugee deal?
Look, I think Australia, there's an argument here about whether Australia is a patsy, whether Australia has independence. There's a very good book coming out very soon by a scholar, Shannon Tow, called Independent Ally. And it argues the point, and I think it's quite a compelling argument, that, look, yes, of course, Australia is enormously invested in its relationship with the United States. It is, to a certain extent, dependent on that relationship. And the book that I was part of, Australia's American Alliance, came out late last year, launched by Secretary of Defence Dennis Richardson, makes this point. The depth and breadth of the US alliance, US-Australia alliance, is essentially most people don't really understand just how broad and how deep that relationship is. But to extrapolate from that point that Australia has no options is, I think, to dumb down, to reduce to fundamentals that are it's essentially overly reductionist. This is something where the Foreign Minister, the Government of Australia, has policy options. They have a say. They are not just lick-spittles, I mean, it's that kind of language, in my opinion, is unhelpful. It's really, it's polemical. We're dealing with issues that require cool, calm, level-headed consideration, and I'm reasonably confident that our politicians on both sides of the House understand that reasonably clearly, and while the rhetoric that's espoused in the public arena might not quite match that, when it comes to the meetings that are held behind closed doors, there's a pretty hard-nosed calculus applied to what's Australia's interests and how to pursue them to the best. And by and large, that means supporting the United States publicly at the very least. Yeah.
And on his trip to Iraq and Afghanistan in the last 48 hours, the PM has said he would consider further requests for help in fighting terrorist and insurgency groups in the Middle East. Is that something that Donald Trump is likely to ask for in this meeting? Because Donald Trump has made a point of saying that NATO and other nations just aren't pulling their weight. The US is sick of being the world's policeman, and the US wants other countries to step up.
Yeah, no, and that is likely. It's quite possible. My concern with that scenario is that Australia should be in a position where we say, look, we have contributed in the Middle East for 16 odd years now, directly since 9/11, and where has it got us? And in the meantime, we have a scenario unfolding in Southeast Asia that is getting more and more complicated, more and more tricky, and demanding more and more of our attention. And yet the Australian Defence Force, the Australian Government, our Australian international engagement effort through the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade is being driven in other directions. My sense is we need to be very, very measured in any engagement with the United States about further commitments in the Middle East, because our neighbourhood is getting more complicated. Our investment in the neighbourhood needs to be ratcheted up, not elsewhere. The challenges faced by Indonesia, by the Philippines, by Malaysia, and in the waters in and around those countries are not going away. They are ratcheting up. And as we face the prospect of Daesh basically going to the four winds as they are defeated in Mosul and potentially in Syria, we are more than likely to see, and we're already seeing evidence of this in the Philippines and to a certain extent in Indonesia, the prospect of this kind of metastases effect of Daesh or ISIS in our neighbourhood. And you know, this is a real challenge for us in Australia, because we aren't sufficiently invested in understanding the languages, the cultures, the dynamics, the political and security dynamics of our own neighbourhood. It's all well and good dealing with the Middle East, but our patch is getting more and more brittle.
Yeah, and there are many other diplomats who agree with you on that point. John Blaxland, thanks so much for talking to us this morning.
My pleasure, Joe.